atmospheric model, he acknowledged some validity to this criticism and recognized the possibility for a limited geography for the Book of Mormon. While there's some debate of whether or not Lamb influenced Roberts, who in turn influenced other Latter-day Saint scholars, it's certain that the current scholarly view on the Book of Mormon geography is not the same as what the traditional view was. It seems likely that questions raised by detractors and pursued by Roberts sparked an interest among other LDS scholars until a more consistent model of Book of Mormon geography could be developed upon closer reading of the text. In environmental influences, another area. In 1921, a young member by the name of W.E. Reiter wrote to Apostle James Talmage concerning some of the religious discussions he had with a non-Mormon chemist, James Couch, who, after studying the Book of Mormon, had drawn up a list of 5 not necessarily original criticisms. Number 1. Let's go to the next one. No, let's back up. I edited this morning. I must have... go ahead and back up again. One more. I edited this morning. I must have somehow got these out of sync. Let's talk about the list that he had. Number 1, how could there be a diversity of Native American languages in such a short time if the Lehites were the only ones that populated Americas? 2, why does the Book of Mormon mention the horse when it had been introduced into the Spanish? These raised criticisms back in 1921. Why does the Book of Mormon mention a steel bow when supposedly it wasn't known among the Jews? How could the Book of Mormon have mentioned scimitars, which again was no record at that time? And from where did the Nephites obtain silk if it had been unknown in the New World? Now, Roberts sent a response to Reiter with the best answers he could muster, but he wasn't really completely satisfied with the answers himself. Writing to the brethren, Roberts expressed his intent to study the difficulties in the Book of Mormon from a critical perspective. I quote, I am most thoroughly convinced of the necessity of all the brethren herein addressed becoming familiar with these Book of Mormon problems and finding the answer for them, as it is a matter that will concern the faith of the youth of the church now as also in the future, as well as such casual inquirers as may come to us from the outside world. He was concerned about our future day. What are people going to say? Roberts recorded his research for those who should be its students and know on what ground the Book of Mormon may be questioned, as well as that which supports its authenticity and truth. Roberts wrote to his friend Richard Lyman that a thorough digest of such difficulties would be advantageous to, quote, our future defenders of the faith, end quote. This digest resulted in the studies of the Book of Mormon, which wasn't published until 1985. Now, when Roberts previously wrote his New Witness, he had quoted from Ethan Smith, Josiah Priest, and others in support of Hebrew migrations to the New World. Now, with Couch's criticisms fresh on his mind, he began an in-depth study into the Book of Mormon from a critic's point of view. And then, playing devil's advocate, Roberts now looked at the writings of Ethan Smith, Priest, and James Adair as sources that critics might claim influenced the Book of Mormon. Roberts, who maintained his testimony of the Book of Mormon throughout his life, raised more questions than answers. But these questions gave future LDS scholars food for thought and, however, fuel for the critics. Farms. In 1979, Farms was born, at least in part because of a lack of good defense against the critics. John Welsh, the founder of Farms, wrote in review of an anthology hostile to the Book of Mormon, quote, I, for one, began my work on the Book of Mormon at a time when hardly anything positive had been written from a scholarly point of view about its antiquity. I believe the balance needed to be tipped back by looking for, finding, and saying things in favor of the book, which implies that most things were not in favor of the book. Now, while currently only a part of Farms' apologetic nature, much of Nibley's work, much of the reprints of Nibley's and articles in Farms review books have been motivated by accusations of critics. Now, on the flip side, we've recently seen a mixed bag of attacks on the Book of Mormon. While most anti-Mormon rhetoric has been added very little by the way of new arguments or additional insights, other LDS critics, not generally lumped into the anti-Mormon category, have at times added fuel or insights to the discussion. With the emergence of liberal writings such as those published in Dialogue and Sunstone, and books such as, if you're familiar with Brent Metcalf's New Approaches, we've been privileged to do discussions and investigations in the Book of Mormon issues. LDS anthropologist John Sorensen, who authored Ancient American Setting for the Book of Mormon, once noted that from the time he began publishing on the Book of Mormon topics, he had urged his colleagues to criticize and thus improve his work. When some criticisms were raised, he found that they had a beneficial effect. He explained that these challenges have sent him back for a fuller look at his own work, after which he has come away confirmed in his view that his original theories were sound. Likewise, John Welch again noted that he was grateful to the authors of New Approaches for his making some valuable points. I quote, "I am happy to entertain new possibilities to help you to understand the full text in its ancient and modern context better. Even the good branches of the olive tree need to be trimmed periodically. By the same token, when I find errors of fact, method, or judgment in the works of others, I will not hesitate to point them out or call them into question. While the wheat and the tares are allowed to grow together in the field of the world, within the house of Israel, a different metaphor applies. Branches that produce bad fruit are cut off and cast into the fire." Which book came first? The LDS scholars have been split on which Book of Mormon book was translated after the loss of the 116 pages. Some have suggested first Nephi, others have claimed priority of Words of Mormon, and others priority of Mosiah. LDS critic Brent Metcalf, who authored an article endorsing the priority of Mosiah for reasons which support his naturalistic assumptions of the Book of Mormon, noticed an apparent pattern in the usage of the words wherefore and therefore in the Book of Mormon, which affirm his claims. This pattern suggests Joseph had a tendency to move from one word to an alternate version of the same word, and that same thing can be found in the Doctrine and Covenants. This suggests the pattern was due to a shift in Joseph Smith's usage of words. In reviewing this article, John Twytness, while disagreeing with Metcalf's conclusions for the significance of the priority of Mosiah, nevertheless noted that Metcalf provided, quote, valuable insights into the order of which the books comprising the Book of Mormon were dictated. Now, Royal Skousen, who we heard earlier, previously apparently favored the possibility of a first Nephi priority. And he was also intrigued by Metcalf's observation, and noticed so in his review of Metcalf's article, and he observed that on occasion some studies of the critics have been, quote, been beneficial to LDS scholarship, and he noted the interesting lexical pattern found by Metcalf. And then Metcalf, he responded to my queries on this subject. He replied, sometimes more academic approaches, even if antagonistic, can bring up issues that need to be researched. While Skousen explains that more research is still needed and that he has not reviewed all of the evidence available, he currently appears to lean towards the priority of Mosiah based on the information available. Nahum, with, if I pronounce that correctly, with the recent discovery of the ancient world site NHM, critics have rebutted the idea that this supports the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. S. Kent Brown, presentation at last year's Fair Conference, was some degree initiated by these criticisms. Brown admits that these charges sent him back to the library for additional research. This research added to his understanding of the Nahum issue and simply strengthened his acceptance of NHM as a plausible candidate for the Book of Mormon, and that this information was probably not available to Joseph Smith. Plagiarism from the King James. From early on, some critics have found fault with the Book of Mormon because of its usage of King James language and supposedly King James passages. Two targets have been listed on there as main accusations. One more. Let's back up. I've got them all messed up. Okay, we have Isaiah. In the 1960s, a critical article was circulated which attempted to show that Joseph purposely interjected variants into the early Isaiah passages in the Book of Mormon, but wearied of task by the time he dictated the later Isaiah passages. This article caused John Twytness to research the issue, the results of which were printed in the Isaiah variants in the Book of Mormon, so you're familiar with that one. And his research, which of course came to different conclusions, has given us new insights into the differences between the two scriptures. The other one is the Sermon on the Mount. That's a frequent charge. Joseph Smith plagiarized the Sermon on the Mount. Some critics, as early as Reverend Lamb and more recently Stan Larson, have claimed that Joseph Smith plagiarized this. In 1990, 4 years after Larson printed his accusations, John Welch responded to Larson in his Sermon at the Temple and Sermon on the Mount. Then in 1998, Welch updated his book with even more information. Now there's no question that Welch's research contributed to Book of Mormon insights by dealing directly with the issues of the critics. To give one example, Welch, in a separate article responding to the criticisms of the same issue, noted how one critic had charged the Book of Mormon with error for quoting Jesus as saying that the righteous shall be filled with the Holy Ghost, in 3 Nephi 12:5. This critic claimed the Book of Mormon was wrong because the Greek word for filled referred to filling the stomach, not to being filled with the Holy Ghost. For more than a decade, John kept his criticism in the back of his mind and was unable to provide a good response. Now that's something important, I think, to remember, is that sometimes it takes a long time to find a response, but they're there. Then one day he found in the Septuagint the use of the name Greek filled with the meaning of being filled with the Spirit, being satiated with the likeness of God.